Welcome to Fandom Post Radio. We are talking about music composers this time. Hi, I'm Kestrel. We have Cain.
Hello, hello.
We have Bran.
Hello.
And we're going to do a slightly different format than we have for some of our kind of superlative ranking lists in the past. Cain kind of had this idea for this new format that we're going to try out. So we've got some ranked lists to go over at the end and to compile together as usual. But we're just kind of going to focus on a few key composers that overlapped on our lists and that we thought we could dive into in some good detail. So we're going to give that a shot with the 5 that we picked out. And yeah, I guess I will let Cain kind of introduce the rest of this process.
Awesome. Thank you kindly. So, yeah, basically the idea was just to give the spotlight to, if not everyone's individual top 5s here, like the best we have for a shared list, and we can go into a little bit more, detail on why we like them, but also just some information about the person, period, like maybe some fun facts, a little bit about their career, especially some of the folks on our list that won't be surprising to anybody, but maybe there'll be a couple bits and pieces in here that I found that could be of a surprise to some folks. So that's always kind of fun. But generally, the only thing I wanted to cover real quick before we got right into the list was, I don't know how many people out here need to know this, but when doing this research, I found that sometimes things for anime can be a little bit vague when it comes to music, especially when it dials down to arrangements and composers. So I just wanted to spend a quick moment to go over what those two things are, just in case anybody needs to know. So composer is exactly what it sounds like. The person wrote the music from scratch, did the orchestration for it, everything like that. And the arrangement, if someone is listed as also the arranger or arrangement, is when they take those pieces of music and alter them slightly so that they can be played in something that wasn't necessarily the original intention. So, like you'll see later, one of our composers is listed as the composer and arranger and everything that they worked on for the most part, and that's because not only did they write it, they wrote it for an orchestra, but then also rewrote it for like a jazz quartet or rewrote it for a piano concerto, and we're able to do that, which is also really cool. So I just wanted to go over that really quick, because when you're looking these people up later, perhaps you may see that some say composer, some just say music, which is nice and vague. So it can be a little confusing.
For what we're talking about specifically, this is the background score, so that kind of excludes your insert songs, your theme songs, all that kind of stuff. So that is what the standard music credit is meant for in anime specifically. For theme songs and insert songs and all those, usually you have 4 credits. You have performance, composer, arrangement, and lyrics. But generally speaking, the composers just get the music credit for the background score. And in some cases, that does include doing background arrangements of the theme songs that may have been written or composed by different composers.
Indeed. So without further ado, how about we just jump right in here? And I know it's not going to shock anybody on this podcast or anybody that listens, but you cannot talk about anime composers and musicians without talking about the big dog himself, Joe Hisaishi. So obviously, I think Joe Hisaishi, everybody knows, and maybe a lot of people's introductions into anime music in the way that we're talking about it here. Tons and tons of hits and a couple little shows and pieces that you may be able to seek out that he's done the music for that you wouldn't necessarily expect. But Joe was born on December 6, 1950 in Nagano, and actually Joe Hisaishi is not his given name. So this is one of the first things that I found that I thought was interesting about him, and that Joe Hisaishi was actually born as Mamoru Fujisawa, and only changed his name once he got a couple credits under his name and took on the name Joe Hisaishi, inspired by American musician and composer Quincy Jones, who himself is a very, very accomplished composer, recording artist, arranger, writer, everything, winning 28 Grammys over his 70-year career. And I know one of the things that I thought of at first was, how do you get Joe Hisaishi out of Quincy Jones? So Quincy, when you move over to kanji in Japanese, is pronounced kuinchi, which is the same kanji that you use to write Hisaishi. And then that's the part that I found the most interesting, how that translation bit happened. And then Joe is just from Jones, so a little more plain there. But Joe Hisaishi is not only a composer and conductor, as everybody here would know, but also a music engraver. So this is the only person on this list that I've found has that title. So I looked it up, and music engraving is the practice of writing music notation with like super duper great detail and precision so that you can have it be manufactured on like a grand scale. So he wrote the music in such a way that it can be put in those big books you find at like your local, well, around here it's called Menchie's music. But those kind of things, he does that too. This man does everything. So the initial works in anime, once he started getting into those after graduating from Kunitachi College of Music, and finished, which you'll find is not exactly a common habit of all the people on our list. He finished his music education, as well as being considered a student of Takeo Watanabe. But by the late 70s, he had a couple titles under his name, which were actually under Mamoru Fujisawa, including one called Gyatoruzu, which is, I think, like a ninja anime. I looked it up a little bit. But you wouldn't necessarily know it's Joe right away, because back in those early days, he used a much more minimalistic style of music, as opposed to what his career has kind of evolved into, especially with this partnership that he has with Miyazaki and a lot of those films, which a lot of people compare to the Spielberg, John Williams connection and dynamic. So that's really interesting to listen to some of his early pieces and early works compared to what he kind of has grown into as he's aged and gotten, more opportunities, more of a maturation of his style. But obviously, you guys all have your own reasons for loving him, but the two pieces that I wanted to say that weren't Miyazaki that I found super surprising is that he wrote and composed the music for Genesis Climber Mospita in 1983, so like a giant mech show, and then the movie Departures, which is not an anime, but it is the Academy Award-winning Best Foreign Language Film in 2008, and one of my favorites from that era. And I was actually surprised to see that, because I had seen that movie and really liked it, but never bothered to really look up the crew and the music and things like that. So seeing that Joe had done it is, just a testament to, his prodigiousness and how he can make music for all sorts of films and, anime and everything. But yeah, so I'll toss it over to you guys, and I think I'll just start with like Kestrel. Joe Hisaishi, I don't think he was on your list outside of being an honorable mention, which is very interesting, but obviously you love him as you do everybody else. So, what is it about Joe that kind of speaks to you?
Yeah, so like, I made a much longer list than we're going to be talking about in here, so we're doing top fives for everyone. Normally we do top tens. He plays at my number 6 on this particular list. He's just got bumped down by a few composers who have been a lot more active recently. Of course, Hisaishi, most of his big work in recent years has been with Miyazaki, and of course, Miyazaki takes a decade between films, so not that much new work to really dig into. But yeah, for me, his standouts are definitely his works with Miyazaki, Spirited Away, Princess Mononoke, Nausicaa, My Neighbor Totoro, Howl's Moving Castle. And I have many of those soundtracks. They're in my regular rotation. And they all kind of transport me to that magical time of watching a Ghibli movie and the world that Miyazaki creates. And yeah, the John Williams comparison is definitely pretty spot on. And to that extent, the partnership with Miyazaki does kind of work as the partnership with Spielberg. he's definitely essential to realizing his directorial vision for his films. And, Miyazaki has stated as much that, he doesn't know anything about music, but he knew that Hisaishi had the sound that he was trying to express. And I think Hisaishi and Toshio Suzuki both say that, Miyazaki kind of undersells himself a little bit because the feedback and the tips that he gives about what he's looking for to Hisaishi are always just so spot on with what needs to be done musically. So yeah, it's a very important partnership in the history of Japanese animation and music.
The only movie that I found that he didn't do for Miyazaki was Castle of Cagliostro.
That's right. Yeah, basically, as soon as he found him in Nausicaa, which I forget the exact backstory behind that. I remember hearing about it. I think Suzuki maybe found him, or maybe it was Takahata actually. I think it was Takahata, based on some other work he had done. He did I think Takahata was producing and had him do a kind of dummy scratch track to the manga, what would this manga sound like? And that is what kind of put him on this path. And then once Miyazaki had him, he was like, yes, this guy for all of my works for the rest of my life. And he has stuck to that. And it has been, along with the rest of the main team at Nausicaa, kind of forming Ghibli, because, some people think it is a Ghibli movie, but Ghibli was founded the next year after Nausicaa's release based on the team that worked on it. So, that was kind of like the baseline was, all right, everyone who worked on this is founding this new studio. And over time, each of them have kind of rolled over and been replaced by one person or another in their positions. So I think Hisaishi is probably the one constant in that equation, unless you count Suzuki's producing. But even then, Miyazaki has produced some of his own films. So it's really just from that point forward, all of the subsequent ones would be animated by Studio Ghibli, but really from Nausicaa on, it's written and directed by Hayao Miyazaki, music by Joe Hisaishi. Kind of the perfect formula. Unlike, some of these other composers who film directors will have very frequent partnerships with. It's always he has done all but 5 Spielberg movies. No, once Miyazaki found Hisaishi, there was no going back. He would never use another composer.
Yeah, that was it. Had him on retainer, period. Yep. Boom.
Locked in.
Pretty sweet gig to have at that point. But yeah, and I agree about the music as well. It really is transformative, and I think not to carry the Spielberg-Williams thing too far, but if you watch, which Emily and I did, the documentary about Williams that came up on Disney a little bit ago, there was a lot of people talking in that particular documentary about how the music kind of makes the movie in a lot of ways, and it's incredible what Hisaishi was able to do for each movie to have his signature style, but make all of them their own unique texture and I can't confuse a Kiki's Delivery song from a Spirited Away song from Nausicaa. They all have a very unique sound and transport you to that world without feeling like you're just listening to this is definitely Joe Hisaishi because it sounds just like this.
Right.
It's incredible what he's able to bring to the table in that way. But I don't want to leave Bran out of the conversation either, so I would love to pass it over to you as well. And, where did you first kind of get, in touch with, Hisaishi's music and let us hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so very much like everyone else, we are locked in this Ghibli train with Joe. I did want to comment on the fact that it ends up making sense why the one movie he didn't do was Castle of Cagliostro, because it is the one movie that wasn't a Studio Ghibli original. It came from a well-known franchise that Miyazaki and them had all worked on previously. And for years, Yuji Ono was the musical DNA of Lupin.
Right.
you can't really like swap that out and feel like it's the same Lupin. So to be fair, there was one Joe couldn't be a part of, and if it was going to be any of them, it's that one. So, and Yuji Ono does make my honorable mentions list just for that. But yeah, so ranking all these people we had are hard because like I went from like 5 to 10 to 15 different people at one point, and you know, something that really helped Joe's case is that I'm sure Kestrel can relate, but he was touring this year, and I ended up seeing him at the Symphony in Chicago, and you know, it just hits a little different when you get to see it live.
I bet.
And it's cool because it is a mix of course, he's going to do his Ghibli arrangements. That's like how he's selling tickets to American audiences, but he did get to do like compositions that were original and new, which I think is very interesting and commendable for someone his age. But the fact that he got to go up on stage, like after I thought like this, you know, the symphony was wrapping up, and it's been this whole big bombastic, you know, what you come to expect with them. And then he gets on the piano by himself and does One Summer Day from Spirited Away. And I did like, you do not realize the impact of a song like that until you see the man who created it just like twiddling away, doing it in like a perfect sonic environment for it. And it very literally brought me to tears. So that definitely helped his case on my list. And yeah, it's like both of you had mentioned, this is just bread and butter to the identity of Studio Ghibli. And those Miyazaki movies would not be the same and would not have the same magic without the soundscapes that Joe created. I did want to say it is that Quincy Jones fun fact is awesome. Like I did not realize that's like what his name was based off. And
yeah, I always just thought his name was Joe Hisaishi.
I knew it was not his name, but I had no idea that was where it came from.
Yep.
Yeah. And I mean, super timely too, because Quincy Jones just passed away.
Yeah, I did not want to mention that, but it is, yeah. Quincy passed away on the 3rd of this month.
Yeah. Hey, it's only thematic that we have a podcast with a relevant, you know, celebrity death involved.
Of course.
Yeah, we have a pretty, unfortunately, good batting average there.
We do.
Yeah, I feel like I'd be remiss as well to keep Joe off my list, even if I didn't really particularly like have a fondness for the movies or his music, because it is my favorite story from my wedding to Emily, and that the merry-go-round of life was our song that we played when we were walking down the aisle. And we had a live trio with like a harp, playing the harp and everything, and it was beautiful. And that's part of why I like the story. But the reason I actually love the story is right afterwards, someone walked up to me and was like, "That was beautiful. That music was great." And I said, "Thank you." And they went, "Was that from The Godfather?" Yeah, I lost my shit. But yeah, so, you know, I have a connection, you know, I'm sure many folks do, to, you know, my personal life as well as the musical life, you know, and having the capability to hear some of those incredible songs. It was very hard for me not to buy that, what was it, Kestrel? I think that box of 7-inch records that had like all the openings and endings, I think, on them.
The thing, though, is that had very little actual Hisaishi work because...
Did it? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Then I'm glad I didn't buy it.
It's not the background score, yeah.
Yeah. Don't worry, Cain, I got you. I bought it.
Yeah,
oh, you fell on that sword for me?
I did. But also, like, getting official Studio Ghibli vinyls and stuff is just an expensive endeavor in general.
Yeah.
So, I love Joe, but I have maybe only 2 or 3 actual soundtracks on vinyl, just because I was like, that's a lifetime collection. I'll, like, work my way toward.
Yeah, like you've got 10, 11 essential film soundtracks just from the Miyazaki ones, and then he's done other Ghibli ones and other non-Ghibli ones, and
and they always want like $50 or $60 for them.
Yeah, exactly.
Easily, yep.
So if you guys could pick any like what's your favorite movie by him? like that soundtrack that he did. If I could put you on the spot this instant, which I'm going to do.
No, I was gonna say, like Bran, I saw him at the Hollywood Bowl last year, actually. I feel like he's been playing here almost every year since then. I think he had dates this year and he has more next year. Maybe I'll see him at the Walt Disney Concert Hall or something one of these times. But yeah, so he was conducting the LA Phil at the Hollywood Bowl. I got real close seats for that one because I was like, hell yeah. Made sure I knew exactly when they were going on sale, and it was pretty incredible. And I guess I've been fortunate enough to have gotten to see several of my favorite composers conduct their scores at this point. But yeah, definitely at the end there with the Spirited Away song, that was definitely the highlight of the whole performance. So I think Spirited Away has got to be the most iconic, the most important to me. Spirited Away is almost certainly the piece of media that I have seen by far the most in my life. So yeah, that's pretty essential in my book.
That's fair. It's a tough choice for me, just going by like the overall score, because like the two that come to mind when you ask favorite, like the first two that hit my mind are Mononoke and Kiki's Delivery Service. I actually really like Kiki's because I feel like the way it captures the whimsy of just like the young girl learning about life and all that stuff. It just like, I feel like something about that, the orchestral arrangement of it all just captures that so well. But man, it's we had to choose favorites to make this list, but I don't know if I could micromanage this list any further. It's tough.
I think I can do favorite composers, favorite soundtrack of those composers, favorite songs from each of them. That would be really hard.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't put you on that much of a microscope unless you had personally crossed me in some way, shape, or form. So you don't have to worry about that.
Fair. Do you have a favorite, Cain?
I do. I also particularly enjoy Kiki's Delivery Service, and I think because it's such a fun and whimsical soundtrack that really kind of reflects that life in that small like seaside town, while also appreciating like the magic not only in that grand scheme, but it just feels like it's a song that like it's a soundtrack I would listen to if I just needed like a pick me up in a way. Like it's good baking music, like that, which makes sense. Which makes sense. But I think it would have to be that, and then Howl's Moving Castle afterwards.
Yeah.
Right. I was going to say, you didn't fucking get married to Kiki. So.
I was going to say, too. I was like, we're not telling the wifey about this one.
No, yeah, please don't tell on me. It would be, it would get me in a lot of trouble. But that's. I don't know if that's actually Emily's favorite soundtrack or if that's just her favorite song.
I mean, to be fair, Merry-Go-Round is amazing. Hisaishi also, he opens with that, at least when I saw him.
Yes, same.
Yeah, and I think from my research, I didn't put it on my document here, but Howl's Moving Castle is also the most commercially successful, so I'm certainly not alone in thinking the way that I think. Like, it is the one that people listen to the most.
Yeah, if you look at Spotify, I think 3 out of the top 5 are Howl's songs.
Sense, yeah. Yeah, and I think also at my show with him, because that was last year, so it was, trying to remember what month, August, I think. So I think in July, like a few weeks earlier, The Boy and the Heron first premiered in Japan. And, they hadn't done like any promotion for it at all in Japan. So he came on for the encore. He did his solo piano rendition of the Spirited Away song. And then he closed with, I think, like maybe the live premiere of the main theme of Boy and the Heron. So that was pretty special as well.
Yeah, and that lack of marketing was by design, right?
Oh, yeah. And I greatly respect it because I have had so many movies ruined by seeing the trailer over and over again, showing all the best parts. Yeah, I love that they did that. Can't believe they got away with it.
Yeah, I don't know how. Like those NDAs must have been signed in blood or something.
Yeah, they sent them a katana.
Yeah, to hide all of that successfully enough.
Another thing I want to just get back to what you were talking about with kind of the variety yet consistency between his scores. I think it really goes into him just understanding the kind of thematic texture that Miyazaki is creating in each of his works. Because one, you have the same kind of consistent themes and styles, while each one is distinct, and the music really mirrors that perfectly. And it also kind of takes from the setting and the inspirations behind it. So like with Kiki's and Howl's, you get much more European sounds, especially with the European cities that they scouted for Kiki's design. Princess Mononoke, extremely Japanese soundtrack, a lot of traditional Japanese instruments and elements and sounds. So yeah, he really captures like, what should this movie sound like based on the environment it's in, based on the characters, based on kind of its historical and cultural context. And how do I make it distinct while still being, distinctly, consistently a Miyazaki score?
Get everybody in the stuff together. Okay, 3, 2, 1, let's jam.
Well, as much as I would love to keep talking about Joe Hisaishi and all of our favorite movies, I think it's time we shift to someone else who I think we could definitely say has a very distinctive style of music as well. And just like Joe, I think if you didn't hear about him first, you would have experienced the music of one Yoko Kanno. So I believe everybody knows who Yoko Kanno is in terms of the, contribution to anime music. I mean, if you were alive when Adult Swim and Toonami was around, you've definitely heard Cowboy Bebop's soundtrack, as specifically Tank in particular. I think that really is a lot of everyone's first introduction to Yoko Kanno's music, but just like Joe, she has tons of variety, different soundtracks, video games on top of, anime and movies as well. So you cannot really talk about, I feel, one without the other here, especially when we go with like more modern music. So Yoko Kanno was born in 1963 in Sendai. Surprising compared to the other people on the list. Her family was actually super duper strict and expected her to be a teacher, as well as the rest of her siblings. So the only music she was allowed to listen to when she was a child was classical. And that really expanded all the way through her first music school stint at Yamaha Music School, which she attended for a few years, but got out of there. Just in her childhood. But she did at that point begin composing super early. So while she was in elementary school and Yamaha Music School, she was composing and I believe won a music composition contest for kids, which is kind of what first got her interested in a more official standpoint in that way, as well as some attention for her work. She learned the keyboard at home and her school's organ, which I put exclamation points next to this in my document, because how many schools do you go to just have an organ laying around that you can learn on? So that's nuts. But after a while, she actually didn't really follow music for a decent portion of, I'd say, her teenage into young adult years. She states that this is because she wanted to rebel against her parents. So when she was at Waseda University, she actually studied literature and didn't hear what she called, quote unquote, rhythm and the drums until she listened to a local like jazz band that was there, a jazz quartet. And I actually put down here as well, thank you, personal shout out to one Al Di Meola, who is an amazing jazz guitarist, and that was one of the first he was one of the first jazz musicians that she had heard and really helped her develop her sound and her musical tastes and chops and everything. So big ups to Al, 100%.
Nice.
But yeah, it was after that, at Waseda is actually, kind of where everything really kicked off for her. She began her career professionally, one could say, in 1983 while still there, composing music for Nobunaga's Ambition. So I'm not sure if anybody around here kind of knows what that game is, but that's like a classic strategy game. And she wrote the music for the NES.
Is that the same thing, or is that different?
No, it's different.
It's different. This is a long-standing. We actually got a couple iterations of it over here in the United States, but
including a Pokemon game.
Yeah, that's true. There was that crossover. That's right. I forgot about that, but I don't think it ever truly took off here like it did over there. But I listened to this soundtrack a little bit, and it's super simple, given obviously system limitations with the 8-bit card on NES, and the PCs were like very basic home PCs. But it's still cool all the same. I found that super duper impressive. That was her first professional composition, was for Koei Tecmo of all things, and doing this video game music. Obviously, I already mentioned one of her notable works, so Cowboy Bebop, recorded with her band Seatbelts. She did the soundtrack for the game as well, the 2004 PS2 game, and the soundtrack for the live-action show for Netflix, which is probably the best part of that show.
Only salvageable part.
But yeah, I have a couple on my list, but I wanted to sort of hear you guys' takes on it as well, because I know there's plenty of other things out there. She's performed in the United States, I think, a few times at an Otakon once, I believe, as well. Though I did not go to that. I had a friend who did, and he said he cried. Yeah, he said he cried, but my friend is easily moved to tears. So I don't know if that was for good or bad. He's just generally easily moved to tears for most anything at all. But yeah, so one of the most famous. So actually, how about I pass it on over to you, Brand, first to start us off?
Just to make further connections from what we've already talked about, because we had the Spielberg Williams, and then we had the Miyazaki Joe, one Shinichiro Watanabe, who directed a lot of the shows we're gonna probably mention. It definitely was like locking Yoko Kanno down once he got her in the recording studio, because I mean, she did the music in Bebop, Kids on the Slopes, Space Dandy, and Terror in Resonance. So that was another big lockdown job that I gotta congratulate him on. But aside from those shows, which are going to probably be a pull for what most people talk about, I actually, aside from Cowboy Bebop, probably heard her work first on Ghost in the Shell standalone complex. I saw that a lot late night as a kid, as well as Wolf's Rain, which is a show that I feel like nowadays has no cultural footprint at all, and I've rarely heard people talk about. But those two shows I feel like had a big imprint on me in a similar fashion that I wouldn't figure out till years later that like, oh, okay, I see what that crossover is.
Yeah,
But,
Ghost in the Shell is I was listening to that soundtrack as well while doing some of the research that I was doing just to kind of get myself reacquainted, and I forgot how much like Ride On Technology slaps.
Yeah,
like that song in particular. Without even knowing what was going on in the movie, I'm like, this is a chase scene. Like this is a combat chase scene, like action thing. Like it's perfect. It's so good. Like talk about music creating an image in your head without even having it, which is actually, funny enough, the way that Yoko kind of prefers to make the music in the first place. She's quoted as liking to know as little as possible, like outside of having maybe the script and a storyboard or two, and then she just makes music based off of what she gets out of the material and character motivations and things like that, which I think is super impressive. Like being able to make these soundtracks and these motifs and all of this without even really seeing what's going on the screen, let alone even knowing what is going to happen, is really cool. But yeah, Ride On Technology and that whole like soundtrack period is great.
Yeah. It's funny. That was the last song that I had on in my car on the way home from work. So very much a car I want to be or a song I want to be driving to.
Yeah. Did you happen to be in a high-speed chase?
No, but I was tempted for a
Yeah,
moment.
it quickly became one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm actually still in the middle of it.
Right.
But another one I just wanted to quickly mention was from the Escaflowne movie, because I feel like that one's a little bit of a more understated one of her works, a little bit more low key in terms of like the kind of songs going in the composition, but just like an absolutely enormous range on this woman. She's created some crazy stellar stuff that, like, I mean, unless you know about her pedigree in the industry, you probably wouldn't be able to tell that half of these were her work. So
Yeah, and I think the second thing that I think of as well, and you had mentioned it before, if it wasn't Cowboy Bebop, is Kids on the Slope for me, actually. That got me into jazz music as a whole.
Oh, wow.
And, she wrote an original soundtrack, but also incorporated a lot of well-known artists as well, like Art Blakey, and things that, really got me into not only jazz, but like jazz percussion. I think she utilizes in her soundtracks as well percussion very well for action scenes and really giving them that impact. And Kids on the Slope, and Kestrel, you can tell me if this is a big deal or not. I didn't have time to really research it, so maybe you would know, but this won a Tokyo Anime Award for Best Music on a TV series, which is one of 5 that she's won, so she's like cleaned up that particular award show. So I had never heard of it before, but I wasn't sure if maybe it's one of those, because I know there's tons of, if you go on anyone's IMDb, they'll be like nominated for a zillion awards, and it's like, it'll be like York County, PA Good Movie Awards. And it's like, cool, great.
Yep.
So glad to be nominated. So I wasn't sure if that one really held like a lot of industry like clout, but it was impressive all the same that basically anytime she would, pick up a pencil and some sheet music paper, if she still does that, I'm gonna assume, because it's fun, that it was just like, well, the award is just going in the cabinet already. But that's I think that's a really good point, Brand, that she has a lot of different variety in hers as well. Like, I think people tend to think about her jazz. I mean, obviously I do. Like, I'm not immune to that. She has stated, I think, in an interview I read with her, that she doesn't really consider like jazz her style, so to speak, and she tries to, when she reads the scripts, just pick and write music that fits the mood. And I mean, jazz does happen to come up a lot, but
I think
yeah,
that makes sense why her and Watanabe work together so well, because he has a lot of background in music, actually, and a lot of his directing is inspired by music. I know way back when years ago, I was doing research I was reviewing the Blu-ray for Terror in Resonance, and I saw an interview where Watanabe basically said that the show's music and whole vibe was inspired by Sigur Rós. So basically, he went to Kanno with this image and this sound, and he's like, yo, you hear this like crazy Icelandic music? Make it kind of sound like that. And then, she goes from there. And like you said, people know her for the jazz for the most part, but then she puts together a score like that, which is so much more like harrowing and icy and like scattered and like anxiety inducing, just like such a different sound. It's very impressive.
Indeed. Kestrel, why don't you weigh in here a little bit? I feel like speaking of icy, we've been leaving you out in the cold a little.
Waiting to get called on. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I agree. She has an incredible eclectic resume and variety of musical stylings, even within bebop itself. In the same way that every episode is kind of its own film genre, she really does jump all around with musical genres, and it is kind of impossible to nail her down by not only genre but just style, any sort of like, regular motifs or even instruments that she uses all the time. Like even just the Bebop soundtrack is basically as eclectic a soundtrack as you could possibly get. I think she's probably the most influenced by just music across the world, especially Western music. Her scores are very rarely like film score kind of contemporary classical style. It's usually kind of, modern past 100 years-ish popular music of different genres. And yeah, like you said, she definitely finds ways to make that work in such a kind of propulsive storytelling aspect of, exactly what this sound is conveying without needing to see any footage. And definitely makes sense that she's an essential partner for Watanabe. Like Brand said, he's very involved in music. Obviously, the majority of his directorial works have music as like a central theme. Whether it's, Bebop and Champloo, where it's like, it's hard to describe how much the music is a part of the story in those series, but it's almost like, their AMVs at times where it's like this scene exists for music and nothing else. And then on the other hand, you have your Kids on the Slope and
Carol and Tuesday.
Carol, yeah. I was like, what day was it? Carol and Tuesday. Carol and Tuesday, where, playing music is so instrumental, no pun intended. And even Macross Plus, which was Watanabe's first directorial work and where he first brought on Kanno, was also, music played a major part in it with kind of predicting, virtual idols or VTubers or the like. So yeah, and his other work outside of directing has often been as music director, which that's something it's worth bringing up in this conversation. A music director or sound director is also pretty important in this whole process. They're kind of the bridge between the director and composer a lot of the time. They often decide, in conjunction with the director, what kind of prompts to give the composer to come up with the pieces, and then also how to place them within the show itself or the movie. In movies, it's often that songs are written for specific scenes, but for ongoing series where the pieces will be used multiple times, they usually are just given some sort of prompts, and then the director and sound director will choose how to cut them up and put them in various scenes throughout the course of the series. So, Watanabe already kind of has that. That's how he thinks all the time. He thinks so much about music in all of his works. And it makes a lot of sense for him to get someone who is so worldly and so cultured in her musical variety and her musical diet. So that Otakon, the reason
I wanted to hear about this given the not fantastic response when I mentioned that she performed at Otakon.
I'm sure it was phenomenal. It was supposed to be the first Otakon that I went to. We had it all planned out. It was at Baltimore at the time. And my college friend, he was studying up in Vermont, but he lived in Baltimore. So we were like, oh, awesome. We'll stay at your place and go to Otakon this year. And this year they had Kanno debuting this new musical project she had. They had Watanabe there. It would have been insane. Thank God Watanabe is coming to Anime Los Angeles in a month and a half. Hell yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. But so I was so excited about it. And then he was like, oh yeah, sorry guys. My family actually has like a family vacation planned that weekend, so I'm not going to be here. And of course, what we should have done is just gotten a hotel at that point. But for some reason, we were just like, oh, well, there goes our connection. I guess we can't go now. So I started going to Otakon the following year. So yeah, that was one of my biggest regrets. I was able to see her briefly. She did not do any performance or conducting or anything, but before Anime NYC last year, for the 25th anniversary of Cowboy Bebop, they had a Cowboy Bebop in concert kind of. I don't know if you guys have ever seen any of the film in concert type things, but it's basically like they're playing a few select episodes of Bebop, and they just have, in this case, the Sinfonietta is what they're called. It's like an all-female orchestra, just playing the score alongside the footage. So they had them playing that. It was at the Town Hall in New York City, which is the birthplace of jazz, apparently. So that was pretty important. And they didn't announce anything about her, but some of my friends who were there sitting a little bit farther up were like, so Yoko Kanno's sitting behind us, that's a thing. And then at the very end, they made the surprise announcement. She came up on stage and she said a few words, so at least I got to see her, even if not performing in any context, so that's still kind of on my bucket list. But yeah, that was still super cool, and that experience, again, kind of drove home how important the music of Cowboy Bebop is to me and my anime history, just as Spirited Away is the piece of media that I have seen more than anything else. Bebop is the series that I have seen more than anything else. So, other than standalone films, Bebop I have seen more than any other piece of media. And obviously the music is so essential to that, and I listen to it on its own all the time as well, and there's just so much incredible variety to it. And like you guys mentioned, Standalone Complex is definitely my other big Kanno soundtrack, and by far my favorite piece of the Ghost in the Shell franchise. And then the one other thing
Kenji, why?
Yeah, I mean, certainly his soundtrack is very iconic in the first film. And I guess Innocence. But yeah, just everything else about Standalone Complex, and just its kind of what it's able to do with so much more time really resonates with me. And yeah, what she does with the music, and unlike many composers in anime, she almost always does the theme song composition, arrangement, and often lyrics, as well as insert songs. And she has had over the decades a large stable of performers, vocalists, who really don't work in anime outside of Yoko Kanno works. Many of them are, from the US or from other countries around the world. Many of them are not Japanese. More often than not, she is using lyrics that are not in Japanese. Often they're English, whatever makes sense for the work, really. But through that, she has a lot of what would normally be thought of as like insert songs in her soundtracks, but they're really just part of the background score, but just have vocals because, like I said, she's very influenced by, Western popular music and just all these genres in general that diverge from your traditional film scores or classical, contemporary, any of that kind of stuff. So yeah, very, very unique soundtracks, and even unique within her own resume. And the one last thing I did want to mention is, yeah, thank God for Watanabe, because even with him using her fairly regularly, she has not scored an anime in over a decade. She has not scored a non-Watanabe anime in 12 years, 12 and a half years. And she has not scored a non-Watanabe anime that wasn't from a franchise that she had already scored for previously in 17 and a half years.
Oh, wow.
So as much as we love her for her anime work, she doesn't seem to be that interested in working in anime regularly anymore, which is very tragic. But hopefully that changes at some point.
Well, we've got another Watanabe joint coming out next year, I think, right?
Yeah.
Is she going to be on that? Is that a
no?
detail?
Let me see if the details of the music are announced. Yeah, so it's got three people attached to that: an American saxophonist, a British music producer, and another English musician. So
Dang.
no Kanno for that.
Bummer.
Yeah. So hopefully someone gets her back one of these days, because she is like one of the most iconic anime composers of all time, and she has done almost no anime work for the past like 20 years.
Mm.
And I believe she did the music too for a Gundam, which was also, I think she did Turn A, right?
Yep.
That's right, yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I don't know if that's really one of my favorite Gundams, but it was cool to learn that she had done that too. Like the web of Gundam and all the people that have worked in and around it continues to grow in my knowledge bank. It's like, oh, we also have Yoko Kanno in a Gundam now. Or at least now, as far as I'm aware, which is always cool. I mean, granted, Gundam is so huge, and everything that you probably couldn't shake a stick without hitting someone in the industry that hasn't contributed to a Gundam property of some type.
Right.
But it was cool either way. It was cool either way. We can move on, and the next person on this list, I think you two are going to have to do some of the real heavy lifting here, as it's the youngest. This person's the youngest, if 41 years old is a young gun in this industry. But I wanted to talk a little bit about one Kensuke Ushio. So I think out of the people that are on our list, he's definitely the one that is doing the most work recently. In that he has made and is working on Dan, of course, in a growing series of collaborations with Science Saru, as well as Chainsaw Man and A Silent Voice, which I think was one of his very first things he worked on. I know there was Space Dandy, but he states he only did 2 songs for that.
Yeah.
And then
I think
Ping Pong
was the first.
Ping Pong
one.
was, yeah.
Yep,
Exactly.
Ping Pong. But yeah, like this guy I wasn't able to find too much on, so I don't have very many cool fun facts for you to start the conversation out, other than when doing Chainsaw Man, you worked with Sony to do a custom program that blended drum patterns and chainsaw samples together.
I love that.
And at least according to him, this was the most challenging score to date he had to make, because he had never made like composed a soundtrack for a like popular shonen manga being turned into an anime. So he states that this was his most challenging, to the point that he had Sony build him special cool programs that put chainsaws into drums. So that's badass as hell. But yeah, I think I'll just do an alternating pattern here, so we can start off with Kestrel here. I think both of you guys have him on your list in varying ways. I know Brand's got him in the top spot, so we'll save him for last.
Yeah, I think I put him at like number 3.
Pretty far up there.
Yeah, definitely rapidly rising on my list, as he has just been doing so much lately. Yeah, it's funny, kind of... I don't know that he really intended to be a composer, a scorer in any way. He was just kind of like an electronic music musician. And, I guess this is the story with several prominent composers, is just certain directors found him and thought his style would work well with their works. And yeah, Space Dandy is an interesting project. We mentioned Kanno on it. That is really probably a series that couldn't have been done by anyone other than Watanabe, a director who's also a music director, because it has no composer. It has like 100 composers that each contributed like 2 or 3 tracks to it.
Yeah, looking at the breakdown of the OSTs for both seasons is just like way too much.
Right. It's like every song someone different, which is super cool. And that's kind of how Watanabe and Shingo Natsume, used that project for everyone involved, where it was kind of like a playground where they all got to, have their individual episode and bring on their animators and their composers and whatever. And so, that is kind of the initial connection of, who got one of the episodes of Space Dandy, Masaki Yuasa, who brought on Ushio for his first full work, Masaki Yuasa, for Ping Pong the Animation that same year, later the year. So he kind of brought him into the world of anime scoring, and, you can tell that their styles mesh really well. And then what's really interesting is 2 years later, Naoko Yamada from Kyoto Animation brings him on for a silent voice. And you could not find, this Venn diagram is 2 completely disconnected circles in the styles of these 2 works, both from the direction, the visuals, the tone, everything about the work itself, and even the score done by the same person who had only ever scored those 2 things in anime. But, they both knew that his talents would work well for their individual styles, and both of them continued to work with him throughout their subsequent works. And he kind of struck this crazy dichotomy from then on, where you had the Yuasa scores, which were just like so high energy, high octane, crazy compositions. And then next to that, in parallel, you'd have the Yamada scores, which were so soft, so subtle, so understated, almost just ambient sounds. And he just perfected both of them so well that, they both continue to work with him. And what's interesting is that, Naoko Yamada then moved on to Science Saru after the tragedy at Kyoto Animation, and has been making her works there ever since. And, naturally she continued to work with Ushio, because not only was he her composer, but he was Science Saru's composer from Yuasa. So I meant to ask her this when I interviewed her last month. I just didn't have time for enough questions, but I assume that he kind of formed that connection for her, because similarly to his variety between those 2 styles, her style of direction is totally the opposite of everything else Science Saru has ever done, whether it's by Yuasa or anyone else. So it was such a weird kind of marriage in the first place, and I bet that Ushio had something to do with bridging that gap for her. And yeah, like we mentioned, he's continued to work on many other properties, including those at Science Saru not done by Yuasa or Yamada, like Don to Don airing right now. He just did Yamada's latest film, Colors Within, also at Science Saru, which just got its premiere in the US last month. And also, I wanted to mention, in addition to A Silent Voice, which is my favorite anime film of all time, and Ping Pong the Animation, which both of those soundtracks I listen to regularly. Another one that he did in the past year was The Dangers in My Heart, which definitely is more on the A Silent Voice side of things. So just to make sure people are aware that, he does a lot of these really high energy ones, whether it's Yuasa or other Science Saru or Chainsaw Man, but he does still kind of touch on the really light, subtle, kind of romantic drama work that he perfected from Yamada's work as well. So everyone in the industry has kind of keyed in now after Yuasa and Yamada discovered him that he's just incredibly versatile, especially for these two very different specialties that he works in. He was at Anime NYC this year. Unfortunately, I did not go because his presence there was literally the only thing I had any interest in. And now that I'm 3,000 miles away, it's kind of hard to justify that, especially now that it's in the summer, right after Anime Expo and Otakon. So didn't make it out to see him, but considering how active and how prolific he's been lately, I'm sure I'll have many more opportunities. So definitely looking forward to not only his continued work, which continues to excel. Like, I mean, we're only 1 week and a half out from Dawn to Dawn episode 7, which was, you know, one of the greatest anime episodes of all time. And seeing him get to jump from his Yuasa style music into his Yamada style music in that flashback sequence was just like, you could not have picked a more perfect composer for this series to have this kind of variety between two scenes. So yeah, loving seeing what he's been up to and just continues to nail it and blow me away with his work.
Yeah, if anything, when I was doing my research for him, it felt like this is about, on this list at least, the closest to kind of the modern way of getting into music, if that makes any sense. Like the first two are like studied music at this school and, you know, wrote compositions in a super early age and very traditional in that way. And Ushio, from what I can gather, started playing the piano like a lot of people do. And then his next step was just doing music while he was at college and learning how Pro Tools worked.
Yep.
And that was kind of it. And then just started releasing some music under Agraph. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. Was like a moniker for his first couple solo efforts, and then joining the rock band Llama, as well as doing the work that he does now. So when I was reading it, I was just thinking like, this is about as close to like the modern way you get involved in this type of industry, rather than, you know, the various music schools and things like that seem a little bit more of a traditional route.
Yeah.
One more thing I wanted to mention about him. You know, we talked about Joe Hisaishi kind of being the Japanese John Williams. I don't know if we have a Western equivalent to Yoko Kanno. I feel like she's kind of the hardest and the easiest because you could find so many artists that she like was very clearly directly influenced by, especially, you know, jazz composers. But I'm gonna go with Kensuke Ushio is the Japanese Trent Reznor.
Yes, dude. Yes, when I was
So he just needs to start doing PBS documentaries.
Yep. When I was taking notes earlier about his different soundtracks, and I got to Devilman Crybaby, I was like, 9 Inch Nails influence, maybe.
and not only that, but if you see some of Trent Reznor's work in like Soul and the new Ninja Turtles movie and stuff, you're like, shit, he's got the really subtle, like, quiet piano pieces down too. He's totally Kensuke Ushio.
That's awesome. I didn't put that together, but it makes so much sense.
Yeah, no, he's definitely got like the, you know, fast, hard-hitting industrial rock down. But yeah, even Trent Reznor's film scores have the other side of Kensuke Ushio covered.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like for me, like you said, Ushio ended up being number 1 on my list, and I feel like part of that is due to the way in which he creates his music and the way I relate to it a lot more, because yes, I can like respect the trained musical ear of someone like Hisaishi or Kanno, but like in general, like symphony orchestra type music like isn't really my lane. Whereas like I do make music in my off time, and an artist like Ushio is way more like influential in the way that he makes music and the, like you said, the things he's inspired by and stuff like that. And the recency bias of him just like cranking out so much stuff nowadays, it's definitely propelled him to the top for me. But I was very much a Yuasa pilled dude back in 2013-ish. So when Ping Pong came out, that was like easily one of my favorite anime I've ever seen. And of course, the soundtrack to that put me onto Ushio right from the jump. And I think it's cool because you've mentioned the directions he's taken with Yuasa to Yamada and like the differences in those styles. And you can really see part of those things coming out earlier before he does stuff like that. Because, like you said, a lot of the Ping Pong score, very up-tempo, more like house electronic influenced. There's break beats, but when you get down to the character-focused songs, such as
True.
The Melancholy of Dragon or Butterfly Joe, those songs, you start seeing those inklings of what he would do on A Silent Voice and Liz and the Bluebird and stuff. And I think it's cool because that would go on to reverse influence, like when he worked on Japan Sinks for Yuasa, he kind of scaled it back. And of course, for the just like the subject matter of the show, it made more sense to kind of creep back into that more melancholy that he had been working on with Yamada. But yeah, he also just has so much versatility in his bag, which is easily puts him up there for me as well, because as much as I love the hard-hitting house stuff on Ping Pong, A Silent Voice is just one of the most beautiful soundtracks I've ever heard. And these songs are a minute or two at most, each of them, but they're just these short, sweet little beautiful spaced out piano ballads. And it's very different in the way he makes it too, because Ping Pong is very clean. And like, if you're like an audiophile, like that stuff is just like coming straight out of his, what did you say? Was he Fruity Loops or what was he on? Pro Tools?
Pro Tools, yeah. Like industry standard type shit.
Yeah. And it's like it makes sense that it came through that. Whereas when you listen to A Silent Voice soundtrack, he creates a soundscape like you're in a large room, and each piano key is almost like watery and like has this muffled reverb to it, which I assume plays a bit into the character being deaf and trying to play into that motif. And it's just such a beautiful soundtrack. And then 2 years later, he's back with Yuasa. He's doing Devilman Crybaby, which Devilman itself, one of the most like debaucherous properties in all of anime. And of course, he's gonna go more for like a synth-driven, like 80s dungeon dark house vibe to it, which I thought at first, maybe this is kind of like influenced by like the Devilman OVAs in the 80s, like a little bit more of like a retro feel. But as I started listening to it more, I made that Trent Reznor connection. I was like, oh wait, this is just like 9 Inch Nails, the anime. And of course, with all the demonic stuff, with the scary choir voices and like twisting synths and stuff, just such an eclectic sound. And then from there, switch it up again. Goes back to Yamada. They make the Heike story with Science Saru. And that's
let me just stop you there, because 3 months after Devilman Crybaby, he's done Liz and the Bluebird with Yamada.
That's true.
Which is like the most tonal whiplash you could possibly get between two projects.
That's true. He's just hard skirting one way and the other. But then Heike's story, still very much that like toned back piano driven, but now incorporating more historically like Japanese specific instruments, but also trying to blend it with some modern production. So yeah, he's just got great range and so many different sounds and styles, and I can't get enough of any of his soundtracks. As you said, you're playing the Ping Pong one all the time, and I feel like that's just a constant rotation for me.
Yeah, and like Cain mentioned about him using the sound of chainsaws in the Chainsaw Man soundtrack. He certainly uses the sound of ping pong balls in the Ping Pong soundtrack.
Ping Pong Phase is one of the coolest songs ever.
Yeah. Yeah, and definitely for the Silent Voice, I wanted to mention that as well. Like you said, sound and the lack of sound and the muffling of sound is so important to that film. and to Yamada's expression of it, and to Ushio's score. And yeah, it's just so subtle and so kind of, underneath this kind of undefined barrier that conveys the idea of, not being able to hear, having, very poor hearing. I think there's actually a cut of the film available on the Blu-ray where you can watch the entire film with only the score, no other sound.
That's... Oh,
yeah.
man.
And it's, just so nuanced. So yeah, it's definitely like, even if this isn't what he set out to do exactly, these directors could tell that he was kind of made for this job, because once he got into it, he realized how good he was with sonic storytelling and with matching a theme and with just kind of like, taking, like we said with Hisaishi, and you mentioned with Heike's story, like here I can branch out with traditional Japanese instrumentation, which maybe I wouldn't have done in my normal work because that would tell the story better. And so he's been able to really grow through that process, which is really good to see, and proves that, these directors saw something in him and knew what potential he'd have.
Yeah. And I haven't really listened to the Dandadan OST much yet, but I feel like that's one that can really go in so many directions because of so many different like themes and just like things they're going for with the show thematically that like he can really do anything there.
Yeah. And it has so much like the show effectively utilizes tonal whiplash in a lot of
100%.
scenes, which can really, I think, play to his, put that shit right in his wheelhouse in that way, because the show is so kinetic and always like leaves you kind of at the edge of your seat, because you'll have these tender scenes of character development, and then the very next scene, like a house is just gonna explode or whatever, and then all of a sudden we're into a battle, and then we're into like a more slapstick comedy, and it very effectively bounces between all those, which must be challenging for the person designing the music. But I think, at least from the little knowledge I have and then listening to you guys' takes on it, it feels like Ushio is like created for this.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, the one song that I have listened to from the OST so far is Paranormal Funk. And that's like a future funk, Daft Punk style song. And I was like, I didn't know he had this in his bag. So really, the sky's the limit with Ushio.
Yeah, and I'm not like super educated musically. I listen to pots and pans metal all of the time, so take that for what you will. But I wonder if the way that he learned music, and he was sort of brought up with it in that learning digitally and doing club style music and then some rock music and Pro Tools and utilizing all those digital things, if it kind of allowed a easier expression of that creativity, like using ping pongs and chainsaws and things, which if you're utilizing more traditional methods and orchestral arrangements and jazz quartets and things, you may not be as compelled to think, it would be neat here, fucking let's just drop a bunch of ping pong balls everywhere and record that and put it in. Like it allows a depth of creativity that is not indicative of more traditional styles unless you actively like seek that out. And I know that a lot of people have some opinions about, digital music creation and everything versus, playing the music, so to speak, not just in, anime or what we're talking about here, but in general. But I think it can't be overstated the possibilities it opens up for you when you can just take samples of any sounds and put them together and digitally augment them to be whatever you want them to be.
Yeah, I think, you diving into kind of the backgrounds and inspirations and influences behind these composers is, very important to telling their story because, yeah, that makes total sense for where he would go with his creative work. Kanno, you would totally understand that, she would just kind of discover jazz in this way and it would put her back on the track of music, even though she kind of put it aside because, yeah, she doesn't do traditional film scores. She does the music that spoke to her in a jazz club or whatever. So yeah, it makes total sense to see all these people's backgrounds and how that creates kind of their unique musical footprint.
Yeah, it really adds some interesting flavor to a lot of them, and yeah, puts rhyme to reason, so to speak, when you think about them, because they sound all like incredibly unique. There are some interesting parallels to attach for our next person on the list here, not only with Yoko Kanno, but I think Ushio a bit in how he creates music. Granted, he has been around a lot longer and has the haircuts to prove it, but that is Kenji Kawai. So Kenji Kawai, I think, is going to be one of the more interesting ones that we're going to talk about, if only because out of most of the people on this list, his credits list is enormous and super duper varied. Like, I know him for the hits that we'll talk about a little bit, and I also have on the notable works one of my favorite action movies of all time that I had no idea he did the music for. But Kenji Kawai really, really kind of covers the gamut, and I think the way he creates music is what helps with that. But Kenji is 67-year-old young man born in Shinagawa in 1957. He only started studying music, and I think this may also contribute to how he makes his music, but he only started studying after dropping out of a nuclear engineering program when he was in school. So he went to Tokai University, and he only made it, I think, about like 1 or 2 semesters before dropping out to study music. But I think that shows like the type of brain and analytical things that you can take away from his music. But granted, he only made it about 6 months at the Music Academy too. So much like Yoko Kanno and her education, it's like bits and pieces of formal that may set some type of foundation, but really a lot of like individual learning and exploration. So as Kenji was in the Music Academy and left, he formed his first band called Muse. Not that one. But they have the most interesting reason for splitting up as a band after, I think, releasing 1 or 2 albums. And I'm sure there has to be more of this. But they just said they all were competent enough to enter the industry in their own right. Which is a super weird reason to break up a band, just being like, yeah, we're all good now, so see ya. So there's got to be something else. But much like his education kind of mirroring that of Kanno, he has the exact opposite way, and his preferred methods of creating music and the resources he has at hand, in that he stated on numerous occasions, a couple interviews I read, where he doesn't like creating music from nothing. So while Kanno enjoys having the freedom of being able to make whatever she wants without having like the shackles of this is what this scene is going to look like and you need to make the music for that, which is also something they talk about in the John Williams documentary about how creating music for movies can sort of shackle you, especially when you get the copy of the movie that they just have bits and pieces from a pre-existing sound library there. But Kawai actually prefers to have as many resources as possible. He prefers at least storyboard visuals, if not created rough animations and scripts and all of that to really kind of generate as much music as he can on a finished product, which I thought was super interesting. So the notable works I have here for Kenji, and the ones that I know, I tried to include ones on everyone's list, even some that I'm not super familiar with, but Kenji is very high up on my list, and we mentioned him briefly earlier, but of course, he's responsible for the OST of the Ghost in the Shell movie, both that one and not that one from 2017. So he's done that, and the Ghost in the Shell 2 Innocence as well. But one of the things I enjoy most about that soundtrack in particular is I think it's the title theme, but it's the Making of a Cyborg, which for me spawned and still influences what I think cyberpunk should sound like.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I hear that song, I'm like, this puts me into a cyberpunk atmosphere like perfectly. The usage of the choir-like voices and the digital, like, not, it's hard to even call it music sometimes because it's just like these sounds like put together that make vague rhythms and things like that. But the Ghost in the Shell OST 1995 and 2017, I didn't see that movie or listen to that soundtrack, so I have no idea if that's any good or not. But
me neither.
Yeah, but he did make it.
Just to note there, the only contribution he had to that movie was a slight rearrangement of his opening theme from the original. All of the other music was done by Americans. All
right, very good. That's
fair.
I'm glad you were able to provide some context there, because in my research, at least, like looking through like Wikipedia's, IMDb's, and some other things like that, all it states, and this is why I tried to open our list stuff, was just it said music. I was like, all right, neato. But so there's that, and then there's the Pat Labor movies and OVAs, which I think is actually my favorite all-around work from him, especially the first movie, mainly because his digital like music that he makes really works in favor of this, giant robot police procedural, and that he blends like this funk sound that makes me feel like I'm just watching an 80s cops and robbers style movie, but then when you look up, it has just enough like digital footprint and sound that makes me think of, it's that, but with giant, fucking mechs. With guns they still have to load manually, which is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. But it's so good, especially the song's Reckless Incident in HOS, which is more of just a series of like cacophonous sounds that also make me think of a computer booting up, which is exactly what is happening. So, and then of course, for me at least, he's made the music and composed for every Ip Man movie, the Donnie Yen ones.
Hell yeah.
The good ones. So the good ones, at least the first two. I'm not a huge fan of the second two that he's also done the music for, but Ip Man from 2008, way different from the previous two that I mentioned, much more sort of Eastern, traditional sounding and things, like lots of heavy, deep percussion and I think, if I recall, a heavy, like a woodwind section and everything, as opposed to Pat Labor and Ghost in the Shell, which utilized a lot of like digital sounds on top of more modern, instrumentation and things. But yeah, I would love to hear what you guys have to say about Kenji Kawai in particular, because I named those, but I also know he's done a ton of other things that span so many genres, it's nuts.
Yeah, I feel like he was a good transition from what we were talking about between, we're at an impasse between Ushio, one of the more modern styles composers, compared to like the very traditionals in Hisaishi, and Kenji Kawai is somewhere floating in the middle, where he's an old man with modern sensibilities and, like you said, taking use of everything that he's got. And it is just cool seeing somebody in that sphere of music not feel like they are stuck in one lane, because, yeah, he did all this anime work that like put him on the map, but then he made the live action jump, and I didn't know until I looked up research for this either that he did the Ip Man soundtracks.
Yep.
But also his involvement with Ringu, like the Ring in English, but he did the soundtracks for the first two original films for that as well. So something that I love about him too is a lot of the time he has a huge variety in the sounds he can create, but he usually has like an iconic sound for what he's specifically making. And for one, when I was looking up because he does the music for Mob Psycho 100 as well,
Mhm.
and a
Yep.
lot of those songs have that. I don't even know what you want to call it, like a kazoo or like some kind of like weird like that little little instrument, and it's just the second you hear one of those tracks, you're like, oh, okay, this is like the calling card of this OST. One of his early ones in Ghost in the Shell, aside from those high pitched choir voices, which are iconic. You mentioned Making of a Cyborg. I think that opening scene is only rivaled by the Akira opening scene for like. Those are like two of the greatest like anime openings to movies of all time.
Oh yeah,
And
for sure.
that opening scene alone inspired me to work for like 6 months on a Ghost in the Shell OVA, where I basically remixed that part of that song and part of Floating Museum from the same soundtrack.
Do you mean AMV?
Yeah.
No, he made his own
Yeah, I was
original
gonna say
animation from
that's
scratch.
impressive. Yeah.
Yeah, I spliced together a music video too, real fun stuff. But besides the choir voices, there's those like sleigh bells that kind of like break up the sound. It's just like a little bell shake, and then like the reverberation from that is, I think, one of the iconic sounds from that soundtrack. But for my money, those bells to me are more iconic, and this is a shout out to DJ, who haven't had on the podcast in a while, but he'll be happy I'm mentioning it. Is that my favorite Kenji Kawai work is actually from the Higurashi animes.
Yeah,
because
which is a great example of what all he's capable of, because I would not lump any of what we've talked about with Higurashi in any way other than they happen to be anime.
Yeah, exactly. But like his soundtrack for those are so sinister and disturbing and just like mind melding that just when I think of those bells, most people, they're gonna go to the Ghost in the Shell soundtrack, but for me it's hearing those bells just like takes me back to Higurashi, and that's definitely one of my favorite Kawai works.
Yeah, because looking through his list, Kawai's, we have that Ranma, and another connection to Yoko Kanno, a little bit of like, was it 5 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, but also did a Gundam as well, made I think 00 as well, and did the music for that. But yeah, there's just so much, and then there's the live action stuff with Ip Man and Ringu, and plenty of other movies. I think the Death Note movie.
Yeah.
Maybe the first 2 of those, but so much. So, Kestrel, you had mentioned in the chat that your reasons would be significantly different, or at least a pretty decent departure from ours. So I want to hear what that is. So Kenji, who I think was maybe in your honorable mentions as well, I can't recall, but yeah, like what makes you so much cooler than us?
No, I mean, Bran mentioned Mob Psycho, which I figured most of the talk would be around like Ghost in the Shell and stuff.
Yeah.
So he was the only one of the 5 that we're talking about who is not in my like top 20 anime composers. I certainly respect his iconic kind of ethereal Ghost in the Shell pieces, but yeah, I think of his recent work, considering how much he has done, and it is impressive how prolific he continues to be after all these decades, and how different many of these works are. I think Mob Psycho is the only one that has kind of made me go, oh, who did the music for this? This is incredible. So, in terms of kind of like track record, batting average, whatever, he's got a lot of stuff out there that the music didn't really do anything for me. But yeah, certainly the variety of his range across the course of his, getting on 40 years now of anime composition is pretty incredible, because he still does like pretty much a few a year at this point, even after all that time. And we talked about we've been talking about director connections this whole time. That's kind of been a consistent trend throughout this, and it makes sense. Like, you don't always have directors and composers who always work together, especially in anime, where the directors aren't always like in full control, and the composers aren't always, incredibly unique or empowered to be original. But it makes sense that all of these composers that really stand out to us also have these partnerships with iconic directors who know to continue using them because they fit their style so well. And certainly, although Kawai has done so much work with countless different directors, Mamoru Oshii has been, a major collaborative partner with him. What's interesting about that is that both of them kind of got their start working on different adaptations of Rumiko Takahashi anime or manga. So they didn't have overlap there, but they were both working on stuff from the same creator. And then, of course, they kind of found their connection in Patlabor, and then that moved on to the most iconic work from both of them, probably in Ghost in the Shell. And even just within Patlabor, there's so much tonal variety from the goofy tone of the series and the OVAs to the much more serious, much more what you would associate with Oshii tone of the films, especially Patlabor 2. So yeah, that was kind of a good platform for the two of them to both kind of explore their range of storytelling and style and tone. And then, that would build up to some of their, most iconic work now. Ghost in the Shell, 2 years after Patlabor 2, was a big moment for that team up. So, yeah, a lot of respect for him. Definitely a great composer. Just not one who is kind of regularly wowing me amongst his many, many prolific works.
Yeah.
No Guns Life didn't do it for you.
Not to keep making the different connections here, but apparently I think Science Saru is going to be working on a new Ghost in the Shell adaptation.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we're going to get an Ushio soundtrack for that. Are we going to get a Kawai soundtrack from that? Like, who are we going to get?
Let's just get them both.
I mean, let's get Yoko Kanno back. She's done Ghost in the Shell before too.
Exactly. So
let's see if eventually every composer that we're talking about today will have scored a Ghost in the Shell anime.
Wow, incredible! It's interesting though because I feel like you mentioned like the tonal difference of scoring a show like Ranma versus a Ghost in the Shell. When from what I know, the original Ghost in the Shell manga is a lot more silly. And a little, because it was definitely like Oshii's vision that made Ghost in the Shell what we all see it as today. But I wonder if a Science Saru adaptation would kind of bring back maybe the humor of Ghost in the Shell, and then maybe Kawai could have his hand in that and almost like a Ranma inspired sound to it. Who knows? Could be weird.
Yeah,
I'm down to get weird.
Yeah, I've actually got a manga. That original one, that 3-volume box set, I think was released a while ago, and I've been bad and haven't read it as much as I would like. But I think from what I do recall, yeah, there's definitely more chibi versions of characters than I was expecting in those like classic comedic like notes in the margins and things about what stuff means and what it doesn't mean and all that. My instincts would agree with you in that it is a little bit more comedic than the movies that we got, but
that's kind of what Oshii does when he gets a movie, because he was directing Urusei Yatsura, and then he makes a movie that's like totally different. Same thing with Patlabor, same thing with Ghost in the Shell. So definitely makes sense. That's kind of his game.
Oshii's like, how can I add military vehicles to this?
Yeah,
more sentient tanks.
Yeah. This is a tangent on a tangent, but I kind of view Oshii in our kind of Western parallels as like the Stanley Kubrick of anime, in that he almost exclusively works in adaptations, but makes them entirely his own. So it's interesting about him compared to like the other marquee anime directors who generally work on their own original stories. Yeah, he tends to use other people's works and make them completely different and so distinctly himself. Also, before I forget, I just wanted to correct myself. It wasn't American composers who did the Ghost in the Shell movie. It was English and Scottish. So apologies to the island of Great Britain. Or you're welcome for not giving you the credit for that bad movie.
Is it, if anything, apologies to the Americans?
Yeah, for sure. Sorry,
King Charles is coming for you.
Yeah, and much like there's a Ghost in the Shell supposedly coming, I think there's also more Patlabor coming as well.
Right.
That Kawai is connected to for the music. So that's a little more far off. I think last I read about that, they're hoping to do something in 2026,
which would be 10 years after what they call Patlabor reboot, which was part of Hideaki Anno's Japan Animator Expo, which Kawai also, returned to do the music for. So, yeah, he's kind of the musical DNA of that franchise across the board.
That's cool.
Yeah, that'll be fun to see what that music will look like and how as it's evolved over the years, since Patlabor is originally from, I think, like the late 80s or so. Yeah. And I think the last real production from that was, WXII, or however you're supposed to pronounce that. Yeah. The third movie back in 03 or 02 or something.
The bad one, yeah.
Yeah, the bad one.
Forgotten Child.
The one that I wish wouldn't be included on the back of the Blu-ray case. Exactly. Like, you should watch this one. I'm like, no, I really shouldn't.
No, it's okay. You can leave that one out.
Yeah, I'll just read the Wikipedia for that. I'll get what I need from there. But cool.
Speaking about just the connections a little bit more too, his first works in anime really, like I said, Meizami Koku, he was working on Takahashi stuff alongside Oshii, just different works. And then he did some Devilman, so we've got an Ushio connection there. We've got our Kanno connections.
Putting all the threads together.
Exactly, and I think that like you said, he's kind of in between Ushio and Hisaishi in some way. Like his Mob Psycho stuff is like, I could have seen this being Ushio alternatively.
And that Death Note Connect, it's coming back up.
That's true. Good call.
It's all coming together perfectly.
Yeah, it's all coming.
We didn't do this on purpose, I swear.
Well, as what may have been hinted, the last but not least, want to be very clear on that, the last but not least person on our list of 5 that we're featuring today is the irreplaceable Yoshihisa Hirano, who longtime listeners may recall was actually on an episode and interviewed by our very own Kestrel, so I'm sure he'll be able to add some juicy tidbits in here as we kind of go about Hirano's contributions, education, things like that. It'd be really, really interesting to kind of revisit those things a little bit. But Hirano, our second youngest at the ripe 52, born in 71 in Wakayama, and studied music from a very early age, as we've seen as a little bit of a commonality between many of these people. Though his interest was due to Baroque music of all things, rather than classical, which I think is an interesting take there, and also didn't really get into music as a dedicated study until also discovering jazz music while in college. So from what I could read, it was more of a casual interest in music for Hirano up until experiencing jazz music, and I think that in particular of the composer and musician John Zorn, who is very jazz. Like, I believe when I listened, it's very experimental, super avant-garde, genre-less, and that is partially what inspired Hirano to, get into things, and also moving to the U.S. and I believe entering Juilliard for a little while. I could not find if Hirano finished that. I don't even know what exactly finishing your studies at Juilliard even means necessarily, like a year, 2 years, a few months. I'm not super sure, but I wanted to just include that Hirano studied there because that is such a prestigious music school. And not only does Hirano cite John Zorn as an influence in not only his appreciation and continued dedication to music, but also contemporary classical composer Tan Dun and Toru Takemitsu, who I think is also a little bit more on that avant-garde experimental side when it comes to instruments, being known for the manipulation, I think in specifics, the subtle manipulation of instruments, which I did not take any time to listen to him as opposed to John Zorn and a little bit of Tan Dun, but I'm sure you would be able to spot those influences. So some notable works include Death Note, obviously, as was hinted at earlier, Hunter x Hunter, the 2011-2013, the 2011 TV, as well as the 2013. I don't know if there were spin-off films or, extracurriculars otherwise. And then the
Last Mission movie or whatever it's called.
Yeah,
and Phantom Rouge was the other one, I think, something like that.
That's right. Yeah, Phantom Rouge was the second one there. But most interestingly, for me personally, and I wish I would have had the time to go back and listen to this, or at least watch it a little bit, is the first anime Hirano worked on that I could find after talking about all this jazz and avant-garde experimental music and contemporary classical is Beyblade. 51 episodes of Beyblade in 2001, Hirano's first real anime professional credit, and that was such it knocked me off my feet for a second because I was reading through the Wikipedia, IMDb stuff, my anime list things, and then it was just all these incredibly diverse musical inspirations, and then the Juilliard factor, and then it was Beyblade is the first anime. So I really kind of want to go back and listen to it. I don't know if I could watch 51 episodes of Beyblade, but I could certainly try to listen to some songs. But really interesting resume as well, including that. And, Death Note has so many iconic songs and scenes that have such drama you could cut with a knife that his music is perfectly paired with. But Kestrel, I wanted to kind of open the floor up to you here a little bit because you had the privilege of, having a one-on-one conversation with the man himself.
Yeah, so a lot to say about Hirano. Obviously, I think I said at the time, Hirano has generally been the composer I put at number one on my list. Probably for the past decade, I have always put him at number one. Right now, he's kind of got bumped by another composer. I'll just mention Satoru Kosaki, just because Hirano has done so little in the past decade, and Kosaki has done so much, and just recent work of his has just been especially on my mind. But I bet if you asked me in a few months, Hirano would be back at number one. So he's been one of the most important composers for really getting me to think about my favorite composers in anime. And yeah, he was my favorite for at least half a decade, since Hunter x Hunter was wrapping up, and then I got the chance to see him at a convention, Otakuthon, in 2019 in Montreal. And that was that in conjunction with the director of, until very recently, my favorite anime of all time, Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, Yasuhiro Irie, were both going to be at that convention. So I was like, okay, no way I'm not going to this. And Hirano had a performance there where he was conducting, some of his anime scores, some of the key tracks from his pieces. And I think it might be the first time he's really done that, like specifically for conducting his anime music rather than like, classical music or anything like that, or having someone else conduct it. Certainly in the West, it's the first time. So that was amazing. It was a pretty small convention, so I got to be pretty far up close. So it was really cool experiencing that. And then he, had like a table to do autographs afterwards. And so I was able to go up and, get my stuff signed, talk to him. And, what I discovered from the beginning of that convention, from the opening ceremonies and throughout it, which makes sense given his time studying in the US, is that he was very good at speaking English. So, a year after that, basically, during COVID, I was like, I bet I could reach out to him and see if he would want to talk on the podcast because, we wouldn't need a translator or anything. He speaks English. And that was kind of like my pipe dream, the number one composer I could possibly get to talk to in that context. And he was very gracious and very appreciative and very cooperative. And yeah, that's episode 83 of our podcast for anyone who wants to go check that out. We've got a good hour just delving into his career and talking about his work and inspirations and how he thinks. And yeah, I wanted to share one thing, just that he said to me in a Facebook Messenger chat, from before we recorded the podcast, because he wanted to get an idea of some of the stuff I'd be asking about, and of course I did ask about the Eastman and Juilliard stuff that I saw on the old Wikipedias, and he said, first of all, I need to tell you that I did not study at Juilliard. I've only studied with faculty at Juilliard privately. Some people believe I studied at Juilliard, and I'm not very comfortable with it. So if you talk to the audience about my academic background, I would appreciate it if you could talk about just Eastman. So there you go. There's a backstory from the horse's mouth about his studying in the U.S.
Super interesting. We should get that changed on Wikipedia.
That's true, yeah. I just, you need a source, and I can't really, source my Facebook Messenger history, so...
just send them a screenshot of him and be like, kaboom.
I've got the receipts.
Anyway, yeah, obviously, since he has been my favorite composer for almost the entirety of the time that I have thought about anime composers and who would be my favorite, his work has been very important to me. I listen to all the soundtracks of Hunter x Hunter and Death Note all the time. Those movies that you mentioned, feel free to skip those movies, but do not skip the soundtracks, because not only is his music just as good, but the soundtracks of those movies are heavily incorporated into the later parts of the TV series as well, because the TV series was still going at that point. So although he composed them for the films, they use them pretty heavily in like the Chimera Ant arc, which is, by far the best part of that series. So definitely make sure you get the 3 TV soundtracks and the 2 movie soundtracks if you want your proper Hunter x Hunter score collection.
Some of the best songs are in that last leg.
Yeah,
sure.
Absolutely.
Did you get any of that stuff signed from him? Do you remember what you got signed from him?
Yep, I got the TV soundtrack 3, so it's basically all the Chimera Ant arc stuff except for the stuff sourced from the films. And yeah, Hunter x Hunter, I think, is important to bring up because, of course, it was 148 episodes and 2 films, and he was the sole composer on all of it. He also arranged several of the theme songs that were then played in the background. And it was a pretty significant departure for him because in Death Note, like, if you think about, all those iconic Death Note songs you were mentioning, yes, those are all Yoshihisa Hirano. But the vast majority of the soundtrack was not him. It was Hideki Taniguchi. So all the kind of like ambient stuff, electronic stuff, kind of rock stuff. Those were all Taniguchi. And that's not the stuff you really remember from the soundtrack of Death Note. You remember the big, sweeping, epic orchestral symphonies. That's all Hirano. And it makes up, a very small fraction of the overall music of the series, actually. But it is by far the most impactful. And the same thing, actually, the Hajime no Ippo, of course, the first series was scored by Tsuneyo Imahori, who was, a prominent rock guitarist who worked with Yoko Kanno in the Seatbelts and did the music for Trigun, and he carried along a lot of those same kind of stylings to the first Hajime no Ippo series. But the sequels to it, Hirano also worked on those and, again, did some collaboration with Taniguchi, where, he was like, I handle the kind of classical style stuff, whereas Taniguchi would do more of the kind of rock style electronic stuff. So
did they carry that almost blatant rocky like trumpet hit throughout the sequels as well? The one where it goes bar, 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 every time he wins, and you're just like, yes, this is the Rocky theme in reverse.
I'll tell you the answer to that question just as soon as Discotheque licenses New Challenger, or is that New Challenger is the second one, because that has never seen any legal release in the West.
Well, we need to get that going then, for this explicit reason of wondering if that made it.
But yeah, so, he kind of stuck to his lane a bit. Like, he was very comfortable in the classical contemporary classical space. And a lot of his works, you mentioned Baroque music. That's definitely where he falls the most in that, classical in the broader sense. It is classical music, but not from the classical period. And yeah, of those, Baroque is definitely where he finds himself most often, but his work span all different periods of classical music up through contemporary, and yeah, he's very comfortable with the orchestra, with the traditional kind of John Williams sweeping film score stylings, and just going back to your famous composers, your Bachs, your Mozarts, your Beethovens. He's written many, requiems, concertos, all your really traditional styles of music. And then Hunter x Hunter, you have plenty of that for sure, and it's very impactful for the Chimera Ant arc and for the York New City arc, for the Phantom Troop, all of that. He really gets to, lean on those strengths that he showed in Death Note and his previous works. But as the sole guy doing all the music for 150 episodes of a romping shonen adventure, he really had to expand his range musically. And, he talked about that in our interview as well, because I was really interested about that. And yeah, you can see a lot more variety and range in those 3 years of that series than really anything he'd worked on prior. And as much as I love those, big, epic, dark, moving pieces that he did for Death Note and for Hunter x Hunter, even his really subtle piano pieces or his really adventurous, young boy go grasp the world kind of pieces, and just the little character beats as well, they all just have so much heart to them and so much understanding of what works musically and what works thematically with the story that's being told and all the different tones that it jumps between, because Hunter x Hunter gets very dark and gets very light and bright and happy and funny. So being able to balance all that, I think, some people argue that the Hunter x Hunter remake doesn't have as much kind of personality to it as the original, and I think directorially there's some truth to that. But I think musically, I think Hirano probably carries the range of tones and styles within the Hunter x Hunter series probably more effectively than anyone else on staff.
Yeah, looking through the works when I was doing research, I was surprised by the relatively large amount of just like musical pieces made that weren't associated with anything, like just for the sake of making music. Like, yeah, there's a symphonic suite for Hunter x Hunter, and I think he did something for Death Note, in particular, like a rearrangement and things. But there are a lot of pieces that are just like, this is for piano, or this is an elegy. I think he did something for the harp a few years ago. Just like pieces, like
right. Yeah, he's kind of like an orchestra and chamber composer and conductor first, and film scoring kind of goes into that, and in some ways that also matches John Williams, because John Williams also does a lot of not film scoring. He does a lot of just orchestra conducting and composing.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ask him at all about his contributions to like the Final Fantasy franchise? I know that's relatively minor. He only did a couple songs, but I did think that was interesting. He did some additional music and orchestration for 13 when that came out. Yeah. And then I think he also did the same for Dirge of Cerberus.
Yeah, I don't think
the PS2 game for a little bit. Yeah. And I thought that was an interesting development, I guess, in that way.
Yeah, I mean, hey, if you're going to have a game called Dirge of Cerberus, not many people you can get for a better dirge than, Requiem of Cerberus. Yeah, but I didn't talk to him about that work specifically. Yeah, just too many other things I wanted to kind of cover.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was just curious.
I did talk a bit to him. This was also, 4+ years ago. So I don't remember the entirety of our conversation at the time. But yeah, we definitely talked about like his work arranging instead of just composing, and how that works with other people's compositions, and kind of the pros and cons of that, how he has to approach it differently creatively. So yeah, that was definitely something I wanted to dig into. So I was glad I got to talk to him about that.
Indeed. Bran, you got any strong feelings about Hirano? I can't remember where you placed him on your list off the top of my head.
He might have got bumped from top 5, but that was in like a
gasp
last-dish effort to like solidify that.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah, but I mean, similar to Kestrel, there was like a time when like Hirano was very much up there for me, and if he was maybe a little bit more consistently making stuff today, he'd definitely still hold a spot. But I did want to mention, back in 2020, I reviewed the final DVD set for the Fandom Post of Hunter x Hunter, and I felt compelled to, one of the very first lines I had in the review, I had to mention his music. And I quote, "Of all the qualities that makes Hunter x Hunter 2011's adaptation such a memorable experience, Yoshihisa Hirano's music is a vital component." And a lot of what Kestrel had touched on, especially because I had the last volume of the DVD that covered the end of Chimera and into the chairman election and final episodes. A lot of those songs just stuck with me for many years. Specifically like the Elegy of the Dynast and Understanding, just 2 songs that probably made me cry buckets worth of tears alone. But also
the way they used Understanding as the ending to that episode. Oh god.
Yeah, insane. I was watching at that point I was watching with a roommate in college. We were like watching through it together. And we got to that final moment of the episode and the credits are rolling, and we're both just like sitting on the couch, like quietly sniffling and just crying. But no, yeah, his music was such a vital component. And about what you were saying, where he kind of had to, reach out of his comfort zone and make something for, one of the iconic shonen properties. He had to reach a little bit out of that classical bag he has and make something else, and he crushed it in that aspect too. One of the other songs I specifically mentioned in the review is Beyond the Seas, which that song plays in one of, if not the final episodes. And it is one of those songs that to me captures that call to adventure of like what's still out there, that I think the Hunter x Hunter 2011 anime, like if we never get Hunter x Hunter anime ever again, that is like about as the best place it could have ended. And with that backing soundtrack to it, it just like is a perfect note in my mind of like what it was. But yeah, no, his music composition is very beautiful, and I would be remiss not to mention a different series, because I know we were going to talk mostly about Hunter x Hunter and of course Death Note, but when you mentioned the Baroque music influence and background, it like clicked to me that one of my oldest experiences with Hirano's work, which I haven't watched this in well over a decade, but Ouran High School Host Club.
Yeah,
I feel like that show is maybe the most like to his strengths type of show for like what the music is and the vibe of that show. Like if we're talking Baroque music, like that to a T is like what that soundtrack was.
Yeah, he specifically called that out in the interview, I believe, and also I think he might have done more Ouran music in his concert than Hunter x Hunter music. It was mostly Death Note, like it was mostly Death Note in concert, but he did a few Ouran tracks, and yeah, he like repeatedly said that was definitely like one of his favorite soundtracks that he got to do. And I'm trying to remember now. I wish I remembered, but there was some, you know how all these classical composers have like their, you know, the Ninth Symphony, the whatever, the this many of this type of music, this type of composition. There was some famous composer who had some sequence of these that, I don't know, there were 7 or 8 of them. Let's say there were 8, I don't know. And so he was particularly proud of one track he wrote for Ouran that he considered like whoever that composer was their 9th or whatever. He was like, I was able to create something that I felt could have been the next piece in this series by this composer that influenced me so much. So yeah, you're quite right to imagine that really resonated with him, that soundtrack.
That's awesome. I'm glad he holds it as close to his heart as his other projects, because I feel like when I was looking up the stuff for this list, of course I was like, what are some of my favorite Hunter x Hunter soundtracks? And then just going through his created works, I was like, oh wait, he did Ouran High School? Like, hold on, let me go back for a second. And listening to those songs, I was like, okay, it's all coming together. It makes sense.
Well, I think he did that in the same time frame as Death Note too. They were both in like
same year.
Yeah, same year.
very short order too, which could be for the benefit or otherwise for Ouran that people may forget that, because it's like this happened. Ouran was right before Death Note. It's kind of like every video game that was released the same year of Half-Life people forget about.
Yep. Fair.
Yeah, and you know, he's also very effective. You know, we talked about some of the different composers on our lists and how they've used vocals in their work. Almost all of them have to some extent. And I think I want to say he has never had vocals in a language other than Latin. So he is very much steeped in the classical...
Baroque pilled.
Yeah, Baroque pilled, exactly. Man, if we can fit that into the episode title. Yeah, that his Latin chanting in Death Note is very iconic to those, you know, the writing scenes in that series. And then, you know, he has his requiems and such in Hunter x Hunter as well. Yeah, and he, you know, he hasn't done a lot in the past decade, as we mentioned. You know, Hunter x Hunter wrapped up in 2014. And yeah, another thing actually I wanted to mention, since you were talking about watching that last set, when I mentioned earlier, make sure you get the film soundtracks as well. It was actually because I imported the 3 TV soundtracks from the Hunter x Hunter series, and I was like, great, I've got them all. I got all the Death Note soundtracks, awesome. And I had been listening to those for a while, and of course I'd already watched the series, but rewatching it on Blu-ray, getting into the final stretch of Chimera Ant, I was listening to the music and I was like, wait a second, I don't have this. What is this from? And then I did some rapid Reddit research and I was like, oh, they used the songs from the movies. This is an amazing song. And then I immediately imported those two soundtracks as well. So yeah,
Nice.
and yeah, you know, I did a 10 years later article for Hunter x Hunter, which, geez, even that article is now 3 years old. So I certainly talk about Hirano's work in that and how important it was. And yeah, like you mentioned, you know, closing it out with Beyond the Seas is so important to what I also described in almost the exact same words in that article about, you know, probably the best ending we'll ever get to Hunter x Hunter is what we got in that anime. And just that sense of, you know, what's still out there. We don't need to see it all, but we just know that there's an infinite world of adventure. And, you know, by that same token, starting the series off with probably its most iconic track, The World of Adventurers, which is kind of Gon's theme and, you know, a motif that runs throughout the soundtrack in general, that really encapsulates, like, how Hunter x Hunter should sound and has kind of always felt like it should sound, is that track. So you see Gon smiling at the beginning, that's The World of Adventures, and then you get into the real dark shit, and he's got that covered from his experience and his Death Note work and the like. But yeah, since that wrapped up in 2014, he had done a couple other works in that same year, 10 years ago now. Since then, the only work he's done in anime is, you know, obviously his work in Hunter x Hunter helped with this. He was also the sole composer of the shonen action series Eden Zero by the creator of Fairy Tail. And that was 2021. And then the only other thing since 2014 was last year in 2023, he did the Helk anime, which I did not watch that.
Neither.
Unfortunately, neither of those properties I really had any interest in outside of him scoring them. So, you know, when I interviewed him, that was the end of 2020, I believe, late 2020 maybe. And I asked about, like, you know, are we ever going to hear you in anime again? Because obviously that's our main interest in him. And he was like, I can't talk about it yet, but there's something coming very soon. And yeah, sure enough, within a few months, it was announced that he would be the composer for Eden Zero after 7 years of no work in anime. So I was like, oh, awesome. So he's back at least. So hopefully he can contribute to it a little more frequently. He was doing a lot of, you know, live action work for Japanese dramas and films. But yeah, hopefully his talents can be utilized for the likes of Hunter x Hunter, Death Note, Hajime no Ippo, these just incredible series that he was able to contribute so much to, because give him the right material and yeah, no one else quite comes close.
Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah, well, we can hope. We have unfortunately the greatness on this list in particular is, you know, obviously, you know, something to be noted, but there's also a lack of activity from a lot of them as well for one reason or the other. So we can hope maybe with these pieces, these shows, these Pat Labors, these new Ghost in the Shells, these other things coming out, that maybe we can see a little bit more going on from all the folks that we have on the list here. But I wanted to also, you know, take a minute or two here before we wrap things up to maybe open it up for the lists that Kestrel you've collected, or that we've had on our individual list that we didn't really cover here too much, and just maybe a quick sentence or two just to cover over them and things like that. I know we could keep talking about the top 5 or so for days, but you know, I want to at least give a shout out to a couple of these other ones. So
yeah,
you know, if you want to kind of list off what you were able to compile real quick.
Yeah. So yeah, I will start with my friends list that I got. So I asked for top fives from all of them. So most of these are going to be from a Discord server that I know them all in person too, but we frequently chat on Discord, so I'll just use their screen names. So from Epica, we have number 5, Yuki Hayashi, number 4, Jun Maeda, number 3, Takeshi Abo, number 2, Hiroyuki Sawano, number 1, Yuki Kajiura. From Sync, number 5, Yuki Kajiura, number 4, Hiroyuki Sawano, number 3, Yuki Hayashi, number 2, Radwimps, number 1, Kensuke Ushio. From Enter Forever, we have number 5, Yuki Hayashi, number 4, Evan Call, number 3, Shiro Sagisu, number 2, Kensuke Ushio, number 1, Yuki Kajiura. From The Keeper of Pi, we have number 5, KZ, I believe is how it's supposed to be pronounced. Number 4, Yuki Kajiura, number 3, Evan Call, number 2, Yoshiaki Dewa, and number 1, No Name. From Cipriana, we have number 5, Tatsuya Kato, number 4, Yuki Hayashi, number 3, Yuki Kajiura, number 2, Satoru Kosaki, number 1, Yoko Kanno. From Horb, we have number 5, Radwimps, number 4, Kota Yamamoto, number 3, Kevin Penkin, number 2, Yuki Kajiura, number 1, Hiroyuki Sawano. From Ancient One, we have number 5, Tsuneyoshi Saito, number 4, Jun Maeda, number 3, Kevin Penkin, number 2, Hiroyuki Sawano, number 1, Yuki Kajiura. And from Soul Mephiст, we have number 5, Yasuharu Takanashi, number 4, Shiro Sagisu, number 3, Yuki Kajiura, number 2, Hiroyuki Sawano, number 1, Joe Hisaishi. And then the one other friend that I got a list from was my friend Sam, and he gave us number 5, Masaru Yokoyama, number 4, Evan Call, number 3, Hiroyuki Sawano, number 2, Yugo Kanno, and number 1, Yoko Kanno. Yeah, I don't believe they're related, but they certainly have similar names.
There's definitely a bit of a trend in the lists, and I mean, just based off of what we've talked about today, it took us 2 hours to talk about like 5 of our favorites, and that's leaving out heavy hitters like Sawano and Kajiura and stuff. So like you can imagine like making something like this is not easy to do in like a 1 episode podcast. So
right,
sorry to everyone that we didn't get to talk about like AOT soundtrack and stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, there will always be some things left on the cutting room floor, but I think it's good that we at least get the shout outs there to cover it, because if we tried to talk about all of them with equal attention and things, we would be here for days.
Right.
Exactly.
And on that note, the others in my own top 5 that we didn't talk about on this episode, Evan Call, and I'll mention their works that put them on my list. So Evan Call, of course, Frieren Beyond Journey's End, as well as the entire Violet Evergarden franchise. And then Hiroyuki Sawano, also on my top 5. Like Bran mentioned, of course, Attack on Titan, and Kingdom 3rd season forward he did, and that was a big boon to that series, as well as all of 86, and one of the most recent ones that he did solo was Solo Leveling. Most of his recent soundtracks, he's been splitting duties with his protege Kota Yamamoto. So Solo Leveling was one of his recent solo compositions.
Yeah, I know he's working on Mecha Ude, which is a current airing show too. I don't know how much his involvement is. Yeah,
I'm not watching that, so I'm not sure. And then last, as I mentioned before, fighting it out for the top spot with Hirano on my list is Satoru Kosaki. He's the main composer for the Apothecary Diaries, which is just a lineup of some of the greatest composers in the industry. But he is kind of the first on that list, and he has the first of the 3 CDs in the soundtrack. He's also composed all of the works in the Haruhi Suzumiya soundtracks in that anime franchise. and he was the main composer for the Monogatari series for most of its run. During a certain point, I think he had an illness, and another composer took over. So, yeah, for the most part, all the really iconic songs are him. And I did also want to mention, in his case, he also composed most of the theme songs for several of his works, including Haruhi and most notably Monogatari, which has many, many theme songs. Every arc has a different character song, and he composed most of them. And one of probably the biggest reason that he just barely scraped by Hirano to number 1 on my list just in the past like month or two was watching Monogatari series off in Monster Season and seeing how he brings in so many clever new arrangements of all of these character songs that he originally composed as theme songs. And the way that he works that into the background score just really drove home, alongside, constantly listening to the Apothecary Diaries soundtrack that came out earlier this year, and made a big impact on me as well. Seeing the range in there and how good he is at like composing J-pop, as much as, even within the Monogatari series, like the horror music that he did for Kize Monogatari is just insane, like totally worlds apart. So yeah, gotta mention him as well. So those are the 3 that made my top 5 but didn't make our 5 that we talked about on this episode. And sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I didn't realize Kosaki actually had a hand in a lot of the Tekken games. He did music for Tekken 4, 5, 6 and Tekken Tag. That's crazy.
Yeah, he's been on those.
Yeah, had him on tap.
Yeah. And I did literally 2 minutes ago just get one more list from one of my friends. So
Nice.
Let's see. They're split up a little bit here. I assume this is the order. So I think number 5, Masaru Yokoyama. Number 4, Taku Iwasaki. Number 3, Joe Hisaishi. Number 2, Kensuke Ushio. And number 1, Hiroyuki Sawano. So I will add him onto my compiled list here so we can get everyone's
Nice.
top. But yeah, you guys can go through the remainder of your top 5s.
I'm glad we got a Taku Iwasaki shout out in that last one.
Yeah.
I had a couple honorable mentions, and he just fell off there. But I mean, Gurren Lagann soundtrack, another hidden gem, Gatchaman Crowds. Love the soundtrack for that show. And then JoJo Part 2, Katana Gatari. Who else? I had Yoji Ono, I had mentioned earlier, the Lupin the Third composer. So big shout out to him. But out of my top 5 that weren't mentioned, I had, rounding out my 4 and 5 spots, were number 5, I put Susumu Hirasawa. And that man almost single-handedly gets a top 5 mention for Guts theme alone. But I will say that his work on several of Satoshi Kon's works with Paranoia Agent, Paprika, and Millennium Actress all hit very hard for me too. But my number 4 spot, which I wish we had more time to delve into, was Shiro Sagisu, most well known for Neon Genesis Evangelion as well as Bleach. Also worked on the SSSS Gridman Dynazenon series. And also Shin Godzilla, which, a lot of that is borrowed from his Neon Genesis work. But I just wanted to say that growing up, when I was in around like middle school, I know a lot of people that they wanted to learn how to play the guitar to be like Jimi Hendrix or Eric Clapton or whoever. I wanted to learn the guitar so I can learn how to play Going Home off of the Bleach soundtrack. I just love that soundtrack so much, and the difference in styles between some of the more heartfelt piano ballads he has on there, and then the switch up in the Arrancar arc where he does all the Spanish guitar work on songs like Clavar la Espada and Escalon are just like so beautiful. I love all of Sagasu's stuff, and of course number 1, one of the most like
How you feel like number 1?
Yeah, one of the most like pumping songs of all time. But yeah, those are some of my Other mentions?
Yeah, and I admittedly, up until we did this episode, hadn't really paid too much attention outside of the people that we already talked about. So I'm kind of learning just as much about who made what music and why and those things. So the two I had on my list are for much more simpler reasons, for better, for worse. But I had Makoto Yoshimori because Bakano and Bakano rules, and the music in there is great, and I listen to that somewhat regularly when I'm looking for something a little bit outside of my metal music. And then the other one I had was Michiro Oshima, and that's just as much for things like Full Metal Alchemist, Tatami Galaxy, which I like a lot, and some of the newer stuff is a lot of like sort of like Ushio, I think, like Yuasa stuff, like Night of Short Walk On Girl and Ride Your Wave, even though I didn't really like that movie in particular.
Tommy Galaxy 2, of course, was Yuasa.
Yeah, so it was just for things that I was like, I like that movie and I like the music in it. Oh, and then of course Oshima also Little Witch Academia, which is something that I really enjoy as well. Like that whole series just in general, and the music plays a big part in kind of a Kiki style where it's gives a lot of magical feel to the world, because I feel like when you introduce magic and things like that into anime or any property, like the music has to carry even more weight because it has to make you feel it, that there's this magical world and everything. And I think it's one of my favorite trigger shows, and then also like that soundtrack is really great. But that's about it for me. Like, yeah, it's definitely inspired me to look a little more deeply into these types of things and to find these fun connections that we were talking about as we were going through. Like, oh yeah, also did this and did that and worked on these things in kind of the same sphere, which is always interesting to find. But yeah.
And since we have these all compiled now, I've got almost no ties in this top 10 here. So this is the top 10 as aggregated from all of the lists that we got, as well as our top 5s. And actually it's pretty good as a top 10 because it just barely gets past the stuff that is only on one person's list. So like number 11 is really just one person's number 1. So everything in the top 10 was at least on 2 people's list. So number 10, we have Kevin Penkin with 6 points. So, number 1 gets 5, so on. So Kevin Penkin with 6 points at number 10. Then we have number 8 is a 2-way tie with 7 points each. That is Shido Sagisu along with Yuki Hayashi. Number 7, Evan Call. Number 6, Satoru Kosaki. Number 5, Joe Hisaishi. Number 4, Yoko Kanno. Number 3, Kensuke Ushio. Number 2, and I should say actually, Kosaki won number 1. I'm not listing the scores either. Sorry. Evan Call, number 7 with 8 points. Number 6, Satoru Kosaki with 9 points, 1 number 1. Number 5, Joe Hisaishi with 16 points, 2 number 1s. Number 4, Yoko Kanno with 18 points, 2 number 1s. Number 3, Kensuke Ushio with 21 points, 2 number 1s. Number 2, Yuki Kajiura, 28 points, 3 number 1s. And if it weren't for my friend Wayne giving me this list in just the past few minutes, she would have been number 1, because just barely edging her out with 1 more point, 29 points to take number 1 thanks to those extra 5 in those past few minutes. Hiroyuki Sawano, only 2 number 1s, so Yuki Kajiura still has the most there. But yeah, those 2 are the clear favorites, as I've said them over and over again on almost all of the lists I got. And certainly probably the 2 most recognizable composers in the history of anime. Hear any second of any of their compositions and you know exactly who they are. So no real surprises that those were going to be the top 2. But glad to see that the next 3 are 3 of the 5 that we went through today. So at least we're not alone in thinking those 3 have got something going for them. They got promise.
We covered our bases.
Yeah, as much as you can in such a wide pool like this. It's partially why I'm glad we did cover it the way we did, because I think it brings a good, sense of most like classical and then some newer voices to the table and things. But yeah, so obviously we always end every episode with a few recommendations. So I don't know if you two have anything in particular before we call it quits for the evening. I know after the Dragon Ball episode we did last week, I went out and bought the Toriyama manga theater, and I've been reading that, and it's good. I can see why some of the earlier manga were not popular, because I don't particularly think they're good either. But it is fun reading them and seeing where like some influences come in, and as his art style kind of refines itself and things, and just playing with different character types and jokes, and sort of how it all coalesced into Dr. Slump and Dragon Ball, like in various ways. Because some of those early works are definitely way more gag, like manga, like way more jokey to the point that it's almost just inscrutable to read. But it's cool, and he has little like bits at the end of each manga, like one shot where he's like, "This is what my life was like as I was making this." Which is an interesting piece of history. But yeah, I would recommend going out and buying that. Like, it is enjoyable. Plus, they're bite-sized, so you can pick one up, you can read it in like 20, 30 minutes, and then, keep on reading or do something else. You don't have to... Sometimes when I'm reading other manga, I get locked into like, well, I gotta finish this volume, so I guess I'm reading 200 pages tonight or something. And with these, most of them are 15, 20 pages, so...
Yeah. I don't have any concrete recommendations, so I'll just say if you heard us talking about a composer that you haven't listened to somehow, go listen to them.
Yep. Yeah, in that same spirit, since we didn't do news this episode, I'm not going to do like recent releases either. Just going to kind of stick with the theme here. So for my top composers, I'll just mention some of the works that I recommend buying. So for Satoru Kosaki, if you can still find the Aniplex of America Kizumonogatari Blu-rays, those come with each of the 3 soundtracks. And like I said, that's some of his most incredible work in terms of background music. Like I mentioned, his theme songs are also just so iconic. So I would also recommend you buy the 2 Utamonogatari collections, which comprise all of the theme songs up until, this new round of Monogatari just came out this past year. So hopefully there'll be a volume 3 down the line. For Hirano, like I said, I've got all the Death Note CDs, all 5 of Hunter x Hunter. Remember, get those film scores as well. And I don't know if you can still get it, but something I got earlier this year was from, Tiger Lab vinyl. Put out a complete collection of the Death Note records in a really fancy red, like, bite out of an apple kind of design for the box. So that is super nice.
It is still available, it seems.
Nice.
Unfortunately, all of their Hunter x Hunter ones are likely sold out. So.
I know. All of those were sold out before I had a vinyl player, so I'm constantly checking back. But since they repressed this special Death Note edition, I've got some copium that we're going to get some future Hunter x Hunter releases, so I would jump on that for sure.
I guess I can add to that Devilman Crybaby just got some vinyl releases if you're interested in some of Ushio's more recent work.
And that was going to transition right into my Ushio recommendation as well, since he was my number 3. And unfortunately, again, a Silent Voice vinyl was sold out before I got a vinyl player. So I do not own that yet, but I hope to one day. Hopefully that'll be available in some form. It might still be available from the UK, so I might have to import that at some point. So yeah, Silent Voice, of course, you can also get just the CDs. Might be on, like streaming download services. I know Ping Pong Soundtrack is. You can get that on Apple Music or any of those services. For Hiroyuki Sawano, you can get big fancy deluxe edition vinyls of the first 3 Attack on Titan seasons / soundtracks, which were all the ones where Sawano did all the music. For the final season, I don't believe it's gotten a vinyl. It just got a CD release finally. But that soundtrack is mostly Kota Yamamoto coming in, and Sawano just kind of arranging some of his old pieces for that season. So yeah, lots of Attack on Titan for you to go grab from Sawano. Several other Sawano soundtracks have also been available on, Right Stuff, and hopefully still on Crunchyroll store, whether through Aniplex or a different publisher, since he is obviously a very popular composer. And then for Evan Call, you're going to have to import this one, but God fucking import this one. The Freerun soundtrack, incredible, beautiful packaging as well, but just every single piece from that is so momentous. Oh God, is it still available? Sound Voice?
Looks like it is.
Oh yeah, wow. Okay, well, I know what purchase I am making in several minutes. Glad we had this episode so I could throw $50 away.
Yeah.
So yes, Light in the Attic has a Silent Voice shipping to the US, so get on that.
They also are doing pre-orders for Evan Call's Josie the Tiger and the Fish soundtrack.
Oh, nice. Love to get Freerun on vinyl, or Violet Evergarden. Hell, that has incredible music as well.
Oh, yeah.
Speaking of DJ, who is not on this episode, but I know that Evan Call's Violet Evergarden soundtrack is one of his favorite soundtracks of all time. So, yeah. Good
Buy
stuff.
all of the albums on vinyl, expensive vinyl.
Yes,
all of them. Buy all the Joe Hisaishi on vinyl. Do it.
I should mention, I don't know if you can still get this. You might have to import from Japan at this point, but there was a complete collection of every Cowboy Bebop album in one super nice box set that came out a year or two ago. I almost grabbed it when I was in Japan. I really should have, because it's so much cheaper there. Yeah. So if you can get that and are willing to spend the amount of money, then yeah, you can't get much better than that, really.
Yeah, so I think we've given everyone enough homework for the evening between listening to new music, watching shows, dropping irresponsible amounts of money on soundtracks and things. So I think it's about time we remind everyone where they can find us, and we wrap it up for the evening.
Yeah, so find us anywhere you find podcasts. You can subscribe to an RSS feed. That's still a thing. You can find us on podcatchers that use that or use any of the other services. We're everywhere. We're Apple Music and Spotify and, YouTube or YouTube Music, if anyone uses that except me. Yeah, all those places. Fandompost.com. You can just find us directly there. Follow us on social media. We'll link our stuff there. We are still on Twitter and Facebook as of right now. I've been meaning to make a Blue Sky account for the podcast for the past week or so. Been busy, haven't gotten around to it. But I imagine, hopefully, Fandom Post Radio is not taken on Blue Sky. So perhaps by the time this episode is out, you can find us on Blue Sky at Fandom Post Radio. If you're just done with social media, then go ahead and email us, fandomppostradio@gmail.com. Yeah, anywhere you get your podcasts. Subscribe, rate, and review. Anywhere you get your social media, follow us, like our stuff, share it around, give us any feedback you have. If you have a top 5 list of composers that you didn't send because I was too busy to put a post up for it, sorry, but go ahead and send those, and we'll read them off next time. I am currently on Twitter at Fullmetal Kyoma. I'll probably make my own Blue Sky when I make the podcast Blue Sky. So, I don't know. I might just be Kestrel Swift on there or something. Hopefully that wasn't taken. I have a bunch of stuff recently. Let's see. I published all of my articles from the Animationist Film Festival in the past week or so. So go check all of those out. Those include video red carpet interviews with the likes of Naoko Yamada, including talking about her collaborations with Kensuke Ushio. So some relevance to this here podcast. And yeah, like we mentioned, if you haven't already, go check out our last episode with the guys from Kanzenshu if you have any interest in Dragon Ball. that was a good old time. You can also find it on Kanzenshu's podcast feed as well. So yeah, that's all I got.
Nice. You can find me at Hellshake Brando on most socials. Not a lot of fandom post-related stuff aside from the podcast recently. But I guess if you want to take a look at that old Hunter x Hunter review of the DVD and just think about Hirano some more, you can do that. Or if you want to watch a Ghost in the Shell Kawai-inspired AMV, you can go to my YouTube. But besides that, I'm chilling.
Excellent. And as always, you can find me right here. And thank everyone for listening, as we hope you do, and providing all those lists for Kestrel as well. I'm sure the non-inclusion of some of the other folks on the list will be somewhat controversial, but such is life in these types of things. And if anything, maybe not having your favorite on the list will encourage you to broaden your horizons ever so slightly. So, excellent. Thank you very much, and we will chat with you later.
See ya.
Bye-bye.